Most people think Christianity starts with Jesus. It doesn't. It starts with a story about a world that never existed, a crime that makes no sense, and a punishment that never. Sin doesn't make any sense without Genesis. Gender hierarchy doesn't exist without Genesis. Divine violence doesn't get justified without Genesis. Chosen people theology doesn't work without Genesis. Obedience over ethics doesn't survive without Genesis. Genesis isn't just the beginning of the Bible, it's the load bearing wall. And today we're going to talk about what happens when that wall cracks. The opening chapter of Genesis does not describe a symbolic universe floating above history. It describes a very specific ancient cosmology that never existed. The world it presents is flat, covered by a solid dome called the firmament, with waters stored above the sky and beneath the earth. Light exists before stars, vegetation grows before the sun, and celestial bodies are reduced to functional lamps rather than massive cosmic structures. These are not poetic abstractions. They reflect the pre scientific Near Eastern understanding of the world. The problem isn't simply that this picture is outdated. It's that the text presents this cosmology as divinely altered reality, not as myth, metaphor, or cultural storytelling. What makes this especially consequential is how the text is treated once it collides with modern knowledge. Genesis is read literally until observation contradicts it, at which point it is retroactively reclassified as metaphor. That move is not neutral. It trains readers to preserve authority at all cost. Sociologically, this creates a hierarchy of truth where sacred claims are insulated from falsification, while empirical evidence is treated as optional or suspect. The text becomes unfalsifiable by design, which is the opposite of how knowledge progresses in healthy societies. When authority is protected from correction, institutions built on that authority inherit the same immunity. Psychologically, this dynamic conditions people to distrust their own perception. When individuals are taught that what they can observe, test, and verify must yield to what they are told is divinely true, they learn an early lesson in epistemic submission. Over time, this erodes intellectual confidence and replaces curiosity with compliance. The mind is not trained to ask, is this true? But who said this? And whether that source has sufficient authority to override reality. This is not just a theological posture, it becomes a transferable habit that affects politics, relationships, and personal decision making. At a societal level, Genesis creation narrative helps normalize a worldview where explanation flows from power rather than evidence. If the universe itself is framed as something understood through revelation rather than investigation, then questioning foundational claims feels not just incorrect, but disloyal. This is how communities become resistant to correction, reform, and growth. The danger isn't that Genesis gets the science wrong. Every ancient culture did. The danger is that it teaches people not to care when it's wrong, as long as the authority behind it remains intact. Let's take Adam and Eve, for example. The Adam and Eve story in Genesis is often treated as a simple moral parable, but structurally it functions as a psychological blueprint, one that collapses under scrutiny. There is no evidence for a first human couple, no support from population genetics for humanity descending from two individuals, and no plausible framework in which a talking serpent and a magical tree dispensing moral knowledge makes any sense. These elements are not symbolic add ons, they are the mechanism of the story. Remove them, and the narrative no longer explains why humans are broken, guilty, or in need of divine intervention. The story depends on supernatural shortcuts to establish a problem that does not otherwise exist. The deeper issue is not biological implausibility, it's psychological conditioning. Adam and Eve are punished not for harm, but for curiosity. They are explicitly denied moral knowledge, warned against gaining it, and then blamed for acting without it. This instills a moral logic where ignorance is expected, curiosity is framed as rebellion, and obedience is elevated above understanding. From the very beginning, the story teaches that moral agency is dangerous unless authorized. Knowledge is not portrayed as growth, but as trespass. Psychologically, this creates a shame based identity structure. Humans are introduced to themselves not as developing beings, but as fallen ones, guilty before action, flawed before choice. This framing encourages individuals to distrust their own instincts, perceptions, and ethical intuitions. If the first act of independent reasoning is framed as catastrophic failure, then self trust becomes suspect by default. Over time, this produces a mindset where people look outward to authority, doctrine, or divine command for moral validation rather than cultivating internal ethical reasoning. Sociologically, the Adam and Eve narrative normalizes moral outsourcing. Right and wrong are no longer grounded in empathy, consequence, or shared human experience, but in compliance with external authority. This makes communities easier to govern through guilt and fear because moral certainty is always deferred upward. Leaders, institutions, and texts inherit disproportionate power, not because they demonstrate wisdom, but because they claim access to the original moral source humans were told they lost. The story doesn't just explain why people need guidance, it ensures they believe they cannot trust themselves without it. In this way, Adam and Eve is less an origin story than a psychological enclosure. It defines the human condition as inherently suspect, curiosity as dangerous, and autonomy as the root of catastrophe. And once that framework is accepted, control no longer needs to be enforced, it is internalized. Now let's talk about the fall, the crime that makes no sense. The so called fall in Genesis collapses under even basic moral reasoning. Adam and Eve are punished before they possess moral knowledge, held responsible for a choice they could not fully understand, and subjected to consequences that vastly outweigh the act itself. The narrative insists that moral awareness comes after disobedience, yet treats the disobedience as morally culpable. This reverses the most fundamental principle of justice. Accountability requires understanding. In no ethical system outside of theology do we punish ignorance with total condemnation, especially when that ignorance was intentionally imposed. The logical incoherence deepens when the source of the ignorance is examined. God explicitly withholds knowledge, warns against acquiring it, and then responds with punishment when it's gained. This is not a test of character. It's a closed system designed to fail. The outcome is guaranteed, not because humans are flawed, but because the conditions make failure inevitable. Psychologically, this establishes a worldview where authority defines both the rules and the trap and then blames the subject for falling into it. From an ethical standpoint, the relationship modeled here would be considered abusive in any human context. Withholding critical information, setting invisible boundaries, enforcing disproportionate punishment, and framing curiosity as betrayal are hallmark features of coercive control. If a parent locked knowledge away from a child, punished them for seeking understanding, and then impose lifelong consequences for a single act of disobedience, we wouldn't call it discipline, we'd call child protective services. The only reason this dynamic escapes scrutiny is because the authority involved is labeled divine. Sociologically, the fall functions as a normalization engine for unjust power structures. It teaches that those in authority may impose rules without explanation, punish without proportionality, and demand trust without accountability. Once this framework is accepted at the cosmic level, it becomes transferable to earthly hierarchies, religious leaders, institutions, governments, and even families. The story doesn't just explain suffering, it justifies it. Pain becomes deserved, questioning becomes dangerous, and submission becomes virtuous. The fall, then, is not a story about human failure. It's a story about moral confusion institutionalized as doctrine. It trains people to accept punishment without clarity, authority without transparency, and guilt without cause. And once that logic is internalized, injustice no longer needs to be argued for. It feels inevitable. The gender framework introduced in Genesis is not incidental, it's structural. Woman is created second, derived from the man rather than alongside him, and positioned as dependent rather than co equal. She's blamed first for disobedience, even though the narrative itself shows shared participation. And her punishment is uniquely embodied pain in childbirth, pain in childbirth, and subordination in relationship. The text does not describe these outcomes as tragic consequences to be resisted or overcome, but as divinely imposed conditions of existence. Male rule is not presented as a cultural failure, it's mandated. Psychologically, this framing installs a symmetry at the level of identity. Women are introduced into the human story not as autonomous moral agents, but as derivative, vulnerable, and morally suspect. Suffering becomes gendered from the outset. Women's pain is framed as punishment, while man's dominance is framed as order. This shapes internalized expectations long before any social institution reinforces them. When inequality is presented as cosmic design, resisting it feels not just rebellious, but unnatural. Sociologically, Genesis provides the theological scaffolding for patriarchy. Submission theology, sexual shame, and the normalization of gendered suffering all trace back to this origin story. Women's bodies become sites of moral consequence, while male authority is insulated from scrutiny by divine endorsement. This dynamic legitimizes power imbalances across family structures, religious institutions, and legal systems. The narrative doesn't merely reflect ancient sexism, it sanctifies it. The long term consequence is a moral double standard embedded into culture. Women are taught to associate their bodies with danger, temptation, and consequence, while men are taught to associate leadership with entitlement and control. Desire becomes suspect, autonomy becomes risky, and suffering becomes spiritually meaningful, especially for women. These patterns persist even in modern contexts where the theology is softened, but the assumptions still remain intact. Genesis then is not neutral groundwork later misused by patriarchal societies. It is the source code. By framing inequality as divine design rather than social construction, it transforms injustice into obedience and oppression into virtue. And once hierarchy is written into the origin of humanity itself, dismantling it requires challenging not just culture, but God. Now, from its earliest scriptures, Genesis introduces a God whose primary response to human failure is not correction, restoration, or growth, but violence. Humans are cursed almost immediately after disobedience, not guided toward understanding or repair. This pattern escalates rapidly. God kills nearly all life in the flood, chooses favorites among humans, and punishes entire populations for the actions of individuals. These are not isolated incidents, they form a consistent behavioral profile. Divine authority is established not through wisdom or patience, but through overwhelming force. Psychologically, this conditions readers to associate power with punishment rather than care. When the highest moral authority resolves conflict through destruction, violence becomes framed as a legitimate, even righteous solution to disorder. The absence of proportional responses teach that might defines right and that control is more important than comprehension. Instead of modeling moral development, the narrative models domination. This has lasting effects on how people understand leadership, discipline, and justice. Sociologically, the God of Genesis functions as a template for authoritarian systems, collective punishment, favoritism, and the erasure of entire groups are portrayed as morally acceptable when enacted by sufficiently powerful authority. This legitimizes top down control structures in which leaders are exempt from accountability because their power is assumed to justify their actions. When violence is sanctified at the cosmic level, it becomes easier to excuse it at the institutional level, whether in religion, politics, or even family systems. The pattern is especially telling. God does not correct behavior, God resets the board. Rather than teaching humans how to live together, the narrative repeatedly wipes out failure and starts over. This discourages moral learning and reinforces the idea that some lives are expendable in service of order. Empathy becomes secondary to obedience, and survival becomes contingent on alignment with power rather than ethical growth. By introducing divine violence as normal, Genesis reshapes moral intuition itself. Harm is no longer something to be minimized or questioned. It's something to be justified when committed by the right authority. And once violence is framed as sacred, resisting it feels like rebellion, not conscience. The danger is not just that Genesis depicts a violent God, it teaches people to see violence as virtue when it wears the mask of righteousness. The flood narrative in Genesis represents the clearest collision between mythic storytelling and moral catastrophe. Scientifically, the story collapses on every front. There is no global geological flood layer, no evidence of a worldwide deluge within the proposed time frame, no feasible way to house, feed, and preserve millions of species on a single wooden vessel, and no plausible genetic pathway for life to rebound from such an extreme bottleneck without immediate extinction level consequences. These are not minor gaps, they are foundational impossibilities. The story cannot be reconciled with biology, geology, or ecology without abandoning the very sciences that explain the world we actually inhabit. But the deeper problem is not scientific, it's moral. The flood depicts the mass killing of nearly all humans, including children, infants, and those incapable of moral agency, along with the near total destruction of animal life. This is not justice, it's collective punishment on a planetary scale. The narrative offers no meaningful distinction between guilt and innocence, no proportionality, and no attempt at rehabilitation. Entire populations are erased not for what they did, but for what they were associated with. Violence becomes indiscriminate and suffering becomes collateral. Psychologically, this story normalizes catastrophic solutions to complex problems. When the highest authority responds to moral failure by extermination rather than education or reform, it teaches that destruction is an acceptable, admirable form of problem solving. This conditions readers to see extreme measures as justified when patience fails, and to accept that some lives are simply expendable in the service of order. Empathy is overridden by allegiance to authority, and moral discomfort is reframed as faithfulness. Sociologically, the flood functions as a mythic endorsement of authoritarian control. Tyrants do not persuade, correct, or coexist, they purge. The logic of the flood mirrors the logic of totalitarian regimes. Identify corruption, eliminate it wholesale, preserve a remnant, and declare the outcome righteous. The rainbow that follows does not undo the violence, it aestheticizes it. Mass death is softened with symbolism, transforming genocide into divine reset rather than a moral failure. The narrative's internal tension only deepens the problem. God is said to regret the decision to create humanity, a claim that undermines divine omniscience while simultaneously excusing mass violence as an emotional reaction. This portrays a deity who solves problems impulsively, then promises not to do it again. Not because it was wrong, but because it was excessive. He went a little too far that time. In any human context, this would be deeply alarming behavior. The flood, then, is not a story about cleansing evil. It's a story about power without restraint. It teaches that when authority is absolute, accountability disappears and violence can be reframed as virtue. Genesis does not merely recount a catastrophe, it models a moral universe where annihilation is an acceptable substitute for understanding. And once that lesson is absorbed, tyranny no longer looks immoral, it looks divine. The Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis presents one of the most revealing moments in the text, not because of what humans do wrong, but because of what they actually do right. Humanity is depicted as unified, cooperative, technologically capable, and linguistically aligned. There's no violence, no moral corruption, no injustice described. The problem, according to the story, is effectiveness. Humans working together are portrayed as a threat not because they're harming one another, but because they're capable of accomplishing great things without divine mediation. The divine response is not guidance or partnership, but sabotage. God confuses language specifically to disrupt communication, collaboration, and progress. This is not a correction of wrongdoing, it is an intentional fracturing of human solidarity. Psychologically, the story frames unity as dangerous and fragmentation as protective. Cooperation becomes suspect, and shared understanding becomes something that must be limited to preserve authority. The subtext is unmistakable. Unity without divine control is a threat. Knowledge is equated with rebellion, and progress is reframed as hubris. Rather than celebrating human ingenuity or collective problem solving, the narrative casts them as existential risks. This teaches readers to associate advancement with arrogance and to view large scale cooperation as something that requires suppression. Curiosity and ambition are not nurtured, they're policed. Sociologically, the Tower of Babel functioned as an origin myth for division. Linguistic, cultural, and social fragmentation are not treated as tragic outcomes of human conflict, but as divinely imposed safeguards against human empowerment. This reframes disunity as intentional and even beneficial, discouraging efforts toward global solidarity. When division is sanctified, reconciliation becomes optional and cooperation becomes conditional. In broader cultural terms, this story undermines human centered progress. It suggests that collective advancement is inherently dangerous unless tightly controlled by higher authority. This is the logic of anti human advancement mythology, the belief that humans must be restrained, not trusted, limited, not empowered. Once this framework is internalized, innovation feels risky, collaboration feels suspect, and progress itself becomes morally ambiguous. The Tower of Babel does not warn against tyranny, it models it. It portrays a world where power is preserved by keeping people divided, confused, and unable to organize effectively. And that lesson has echoed far beyond the story itself, shaping how authority responds to unity, how institutions fear cooperation, and how progress is often treated as something to be managed rather than embraced. The concept of a chosen people introduced in Genesis marks a decisive shift in the moral architecture of the text. God begins selecting favorites, individuals and lineages who receive protection, blessing, and promise, not because of demonstrated ethical superiority, but because of divine preference. Blessings are inherited rather than earned, passed down through bloodlines rather than behavior. This introduces a moral asymmetry at the heart of the narrative. Some people are closer to goodness by birth, while others exist outside the circle of favor, regardless of conduct. Psychologically, this framing reshapes moral identity around status instead of action. Worth becomes something conferred, not cultivated. Those inside the chosen group are encouraged to see themselves as special, protected, and justified, even when their actions mirror or exceed the harm of those outside it. This creates a powerful cognitive buffer against self critique. When identity itself is sanctified, accountability feels optional, and moral reflection becomes secondary to group loyalty. Sociologically, chosen people theology lays the groundwork for ethnic exceptionalism and divine favoritism. Violence, exploitation, and displacement can be reframed as obedience when enacted by the chosen, while the same actions are condemned when committed by others. This produces moral double standards that are not accidental but structural. The narrative does not merely tolerate injustice, it rationalizes it through election. Power is no longer evaluated by its effects, but by who wields it. This logic has enduring consequences. When chosenness is treated as inherited status, it becomes easily transferable to nationalism, racial hierarchy, and ideological supremacy. The belief that we are different quietly becomes we are entitled. Outsiders then are no longer neighbors with competing interests, they are obstacles to destiny. Once moral worth is tied to election rather than empathy, exclusion feels righteous and domination feels deserved. Genesis then does not simply describe a people set apart for responsibility. It introduces a framework where favoritism is holy and inequality is justified by design. By embedding chosenness into the origin story, the text transforms privilege into providence and power into the proof of moral standing. And once that equation is accepted, injustice no longer needs to hide, it can claim divine backing. One of the deepest ironies surrounding Genesis is that the way it is most aggressively defended today is historically indefensible. Genesis is not a single unified work authored by one mind with one theology. It's a composite text formed from multiple oral traditions, written sources, and editorial layers stitched together over time by communities with differing concerns and worldviews. This is why the book opens with two creation accounts that conflict in order, emphasis, and even theology. These are not complementary perspectives, they are competing explanations preserved side by side. Historically, ancient audiences were far more literate in genre than modern literalists. They understood myth, cosmology, genealogy, and theological storytelling as distinct modes of meaning, not as scientific reportage. Genesis functioned as an origin narrative, explaining identity, order, and belonging, not as a transcript for physical events. The people who preserved these stories were not confused about whether the sky was a solid dome or whether animals fit on a boat. They were articulating meaning through the symbolic language available to them. The push towards strict literalism is a modern development, emerging largely in response to scientific advancement. As empirical explanations of the world displaced ancient cosmologies, certain religious movements doubled down on textual absolutism, not to preserve ancient intent, but to preserve authority. Literalism became a defensive posture. Psychologically, this creates cognitive dissonance. Believers are asked to affirm interpretations the original authors never intended, then defend them as essential to the faith. Sociologically, literalism functions as a gatekeeping mechanism. If Genesis must be literally true to be spiritually valid, then questioning it becomes a moral failure rather than an intellectual one. This shifts debate from evidence to loyalty and from understanding to obedience. Communities built on this framework reward certainty over curiosity and conformity over comprehension. The text becomes less of a source of wisdom and more a test of allegiance. The irony is unavoidable. Modern literalists often misread Genesis more severely than ancient readers ever did. In trying to protect the Bible's authority, they distort its nature, flatten its diversity, and weaponize it against knowledge itself. Genesis was never meant to be read as a science textbook or a historical record. Treating it as such doesn't honor the text. It transforms it into something it was never intended to be, and then demands everyone else submit to the mistake. Christianity's fierce defense of Genesis is not primarily about historical truth, it's about structural necessity. If Genesis collapses, the doctrine of original sin collapses with it. Without a literal or semi literal fall, there is no inherited guilt passed down through humanity, no universal moral defect requiring supernatural repair. And without original sin, the central problem Christianity claims to solve no longer exists. The narrative loses its starting wound. Once original sin fails, the need for Jesus as a cosmic solution also fails. Atonement theology depends on a catastrophic moral rupture at the beginning of human history, one that only divine sacrifice can undo. If humanity was never fallen in the way Genesis describes, then the logic of substitutionary death becomes incoherent. Salvation shifts from rescue to reinterpretation, and the cross becomes symbolic rather than necessary. Christianity is no longer the cure for a fatal condition, it becomes one philosophy among many addressing the human experience. Psychologically, this creates existential pressure to preserve Genesis at all cost. When a belief system is built like a load bearing structure, removing the foundation threatens collapse higher up. This produces defensive reasoning when evidence is filtered not by accuracy, but by threat level. Questions about Genesis are treated as spiritual danger signals, not intellectual inquiries. Doubt becomes moralized because it destabilizes identity, purpose, and cosmic meaning all at once. Genesis underwrites authority. If the story is negotiable, then so are the hierarchies, moral claims, and the obedience structure built upon it. Clerical authority weakens when its origin story becomes symbolic rather than absolute. Institutional power depends on certainty, especially certainty about human brokenness and the exclusive path to repair. Genesis provides that certainty. Letting it go would require Christianity to renegotiate its moral authority rather than assume it. This is why Genesis is defended so aggressively, not because it withstands scrutiny, but because too much depends on it. It's not protected as truth, it's protected as infrastructure. And once that becomes clear, the debate shifts. The question is no longer whether Genesis is accurate, but whether a belief system should be preserved when its survival requires resisting evidence, suppressing inquiry, and framing necessity as truth. Genesis endures not because it explains reality well, but because without it, the system built on top of it has to change. If what we've been talking about today resonates, if you felt the tension between fear and clarity, identity and certainty, morality and authority, you're not alone. Most people aren't struggling because they lack intelligence or effort. They're struggling because they lack orientation. They're trying to make sense of life while standing in the wreckage of old frameworks that no longer work or make sense. That's why we gather every week for Sunday sessions at Bridge City. Sunday sessions are structured, people centered gatherings designed to help you locate yourself emotionally, psychologically, and socially in real time. We slow the world down for an hour or so and do something rare. We reconnect the dots, not to tell you what to think, but to help you see the patterns, the pressures, and the systems shaping your life so you can respond instead of react. Our January conversation series is Life's Big Questions, where we're going to be tackling four of the hardest questions people face after faith: fear, identity, morality, and purpose. Not with superstition, not with shame, and not with any easy answers, but with clarity, language, and coherence. Over time, people who engage these sessions start to notice something shift in their lives. They begin to recognize patterns sooner. They regulate emotions faster. They waste less energy fighting confusion. Their values and actions actually begin to align. They show up calmer, clearer, and more grounded in their relationships, their work, and their leadership. Not because they were motivated, but because things finally made sense. Zoom out even further, and this is bigger than any one person. Weekly gatherings like this create shared attention in a fragmented world. They rebuild language for experiences people couldn't. They form culture, not through rules or dogma, but through modeling curiosity, humility, and even thoughtful disagreement. This is how societies stabilize when old religious structures fade, but human needs remain. So if you're deconstructing, if you're rebuilding, if you're asking better questions than the ones you were given, join us for Sunday sessions. Come as you are, think out loud, get oriented, not to be told what to be, but to make sense of who you already are and who you're choosing to become. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, keep rising.